Today we're going to go over the spinal cord model, the transverse view for Bio 110 and Bio 112. The items to identify can be found on Lab Manual page 13, and the images for identification can be found on the Atlas of Anatomy page 40. The first thing that we're going to identify is the periosteum. Remember that the periosteum is the connective tissue covering of the bone. So we're seeing the spinal bone right here, and this tissue that goes all the way around the bone is going to be the periosteum. Just deep to the periosteum, we're going to see a space here. This whole area is the epidural space, and you can see it is filled with epidural fat as well as the blood vessels, which we see in cross-section here. So you can be asked to identify the space or the content of the space, which would be the epidural fat. As we move towards the spinal cord, the first connective tissue covering that we're going to see that helps protect the spinal cord is called the dura mater. There are three spinal cord meningeal layers. The outermost, the toughest, the most durable is the dura mater, and we see that outlined here. This thin little black line is going to be the separator between the dura mater and the next layer in, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So we had seen the dura mater, which I'm now going to point out with this new arrow here. The inner layer of the dura mater, the next layer that we'll talk about, is the arachnoid mater. Now this thin black line is separating the dura mater from the arachnoid mater, and this whole area here all the way around is going to be the arachnoid mater. And then you can see that it forms kind of a little moat area here, which we'll see on the next slide, is called the subarachnoid space. If you think of the dura mater and the arachnoid mater as two pairs of socks, the dura mater is more like a gym sock, one that you would wear with tennis shoes, and the arachnoid mater would be more like a dress sock. So these two layers are right next to each other, the dress sock first and then the dura mater. So I'd mentioned before about the subarachnoid space. The claim to fame for the subarachnoid space is that it's going to contain what we call CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid. And this is actually the fluid that surrounds and protects your cord, your spinal cord. So if the dura mater was like a gym sock and the arachnoid mater was like a dress sock, the pia mater would be like a pair of pantyhose. And so those hose would be right up against the skin, or in this instance, it's right up against the spinal cord. So the pia mater is not distinguishable from the outer side of the spinal cord. Now we're looking at the spinal cord itself, and we can divide the spinal cord cross-section into two categories of color, at least. White matter, which is going to have your myelinated axons, and gray matter, which will have your cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. So this is the white matter, and it's found all the way surrounding this butterfly-like structure. All of this here is white matter. And on this picture, we can see the white matter as well. I'm pointing out the three different areas, and of course this is going to be on the right and left side of the spinal cord. Then we can look at the gray matter. Now the gray matter, as well as the white matter, can be distinguished by the different areas that it exists in. For instance, this is the posterior aspect of the cord. So this little posterior portion of what appears to be a butterfly wing is the posterior gray horn or dorsal gray horn. The dorsal gray horn can also be seen on this model. Again, this kind of resembles a butterfly, so just think of it, the tail end of the butterfly wing is the dorsal or posterior area. On this view, we're highlighting the lateral gray horn, so it's kind of in this area here. The lateral gray horn can be seen on this view as well. And then we're going to move to the anterior horn, or anterior gray horn as it may be called, and it can also be called the ventral gray horn. This too is showing the ventral gray horn. So for the lab test, what I'll try to do is make sure that if I'm going for posterior, the arrow is going to be at the very back. If I'm going for lateral, it's going to be very off to the side. And if we're going for anterior, it'll be towards the front. That way you don't have a lot of confusion. if you always think of the posterior aspect as the long extended part of the butterfly tip, and it almost is always going to be close to or touching the edge of the spinal cord, the anterior, there is a lot more space between the front of the cord to the gray matter. So that's going to always help you figure out that that's the anterior aspect. Another thing that you would see on the posterior aspect only is this bulbous structure, which we'll talk about in a few slides. Okay, those are always going to be shown at the posterior aspect of the cord. Now, the cord has connections right and left side. This crossbar right through here is going to be connecting the right to left side, and then there's a hole in the center of it. That is called the central canal. And you can see the central canal right here as well. The crossbar or connection from right to left side of the cord is called the gray commissure. And on this particular shot, the gray commissure is this area here. It's a little bit thicker on this model than it is on the other one. Now, one way you can distinguish anterior versus posterior, if you had the full cross section, which we see on page 40, this actually back here is the spinous process, and the spinous process is always posterior, and this is the cervical vertebral body, and that's always going to be anterior. But another way that we can tell anterior versus posterior is in the front, the anterior median fissure is a lot larger crack, so to speak, so that the separation between the right and left sides of the cord has a little bit wider separation on the front, and thus the term fissure. So this is the anterior median fissure. We can also see the anterior median fissure on this side as well. So again, it's a much larger crack or crevice, so to speak, and thus we use the term fissure. And on the posterior aspect, we have the posterior median sulcus. And you can see that on the posterior aspect, the pia mater, which we see coming in clearly on the anterior aspect, doesn't go down and into that sulcus. It just keeps continuing on. And again, the posterior median sulcus seen here. Another clue would be these posterior bulbous structures, which we'll talk about shortly. So those posterior bulbous structures, we can see them on either side. This is called the dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion. What will be found here are the cell bodies of these sensory neurons. And so it's a rather important area. This is the area where when people have chickenpox, the virus kind of goes to this area and becomes dormant, and then when it gets activated at later times in life, that's when people experience shingles, and it gives you a lot of pain along those nerves because the cell body is getting irritated by the virus. And again, on this structure we see these bulbous structures here are the dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion. So off of the posterior aspect of the cord, we have these posterior roots that come in, or actually they're traveling in towards the cord, but coming off of the cord, we have ventral roots. They are going to actually join together in this area that is shown, and they're going to form the spinal nerve. So the ventral roots that are coming off the cord are actually going to be motor, and the posterior or dorsal roots that are going towards the cord are going to be sensory. And so each spinal nerve is going to have contributions from sensory neurons as well as motor neurons, and then that will eventually split, which we see here, and we'll talk about that split in just a second. So this gives you a little bit better idea. These sensory neurons are coming into the cord to deliver information, and the motor neurons are exiting the cord to deliver action commands out to the skeletal muscles and organs. They're going to join together in this area here and exchange fibers, and they're going to create what we call spinal nerves, and the spinal nerves will then split. What we're looking at here is the dorsal root, which contributes to the spinal nerve. The dorsal root actually is sensory in nature, so it brings information into the spinal cord. So the dorsal root actually comes in and projects its axon into the posterior gray horn. So this area here of the posterior gray horn is mostly for sensory processing. The cell bodies in this area process the sensory information. And we can see the dorsal root shown here as well. So here's our posterior or dorsal root ganglion where the cell body of the sensory neuron is, and it sends its axon into the posterior portion of the spinal cord, the gray horn. Now what we're looking at is the ventral root. So the ventral root, the cell bodies for the ventral root are actually found in the anterior gray horn, and so they're going to send their axons out to create part of the spinal nerve. So the ventral root is the motor portion of the spinal nerve. So what we see here is the ventral root again. One more time, the cell bodies actually are found in the anterior gray horn, and they're going to send their axons out to help form part of the spinal nerve. So this is the ventral root, the motor portion of the spinal nerve. And this concludes the spinal cord model, the transverse view for Bio 110 and Bio 112, as seen on Lab Manual page 13 and the Atlas of Anatomy page 40. I hope you have enjoyed your learning experience.